And I'm the Director of Community Engagement at the Center for Climate Literacy at the University of Minnesota, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. We understand our work here at the Center toward climate literacy to be an issue of educational, racial, social, and climate justice, one that recognizes colonial legacies while striving for equitable relations in the present to secure a more sustainable future. Today's panelists are thoroughly committed to the same work, and I'm honored to be in community with them and with you. And I won't say much more because I'm really excited to learn from them too, but I do want to introduce them to y'all. With us today is Dr. Alex Panos, who is Assistant Professor in the Literacy Studies program at the University of South Florida. Prior to joining USF, she served as Assistant Professor of Elementary Literacy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Dr. Panos' research interests include critical, disciplinary, and media literacy, children's literature, spatial and geographic dimensions of education, and the complex interdependencies of schools and their communities. Dr. Panos also serves as an editor for Climate Literacy and Education, the first issue of which was just released 2 days ago. With us also is Dr. James Damico, Professor of Literacy, Culture, and Language Education at Indiana University. He received his PhD in Curriculum, Teaching, and Educational Policy from Michigan State University, and his scholarship and teaching center on critical literacies and inquiry-based approaches for working with digital media and complex topics, especially climate change. He's the author of a number of journal articles and book chapters, including Confronting Denial, Literacy, Social Studies, and Climate Change, released in 2022 and co-authored by Mark Baildon. Welcome, Alex and James. Thank you both for being here. I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Panos, and I think today what our structure is going to be is that James is going to take some time to speak powerfully about his work on climate denial related to his recent book and moving towards eco-justice. And then towards the end, I'm going to share some stories from using ideas from his book and from work on the climate denial inquiry model with teachers in Florida. So I'm going to hand it off to James, and I will be back at the end.
Great, thanks so much, Alex. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay. So thank you so much for the invitation to talk with you today, to share some of my thinking about how we can confront climate denial and advance ecological or eco-justice. I continue to be inspired by the work of the Center for Climate Literacy, so much productive and engaging work going on with the center. So I want to ground my thoughts today as an attempt to address these three questions. Where are we now? How did we get here? And where do we go from here? In a high-level response to these three questions can be communicated with 17 words. Where are we now? There are 10 words that provide clear, concise information about climate science and the reality of our global climate crisis. The second question, how do we get here? Or why are we now grappling with this climate crisis? The short answer to that question is industry-led climate denial. And for the third question, where do we go from here? We need to do two things. We needed to confront climate denial and advance ecological justice. And there is a follow-up sub-question for this third question, and that is, how do we get there? And how do we do this? So I think one way we do this is to see ourselves as detectives of climate denial and as delegates of climate justice. Justice is foundational. We need to address inequitable social and material conditions that have led to our current climate crisis and understand how the consequences of climate change are disproportionately felt across the United States and around the world. And we can take up these identities as detectives and delegates in various aspects of our lives, as teachers, as students, researchers, parents, citizens, neighbors, etc. And one compelling way to do this is through inquiry, posing and pursuing questions that can chart these pathways from climate denial to eco-justice. And here is an instructional model to highlight these key components and cultivate these pathways, and we'll be exploring this model in much more depth as we proceed. Before doing that, I want to briefly locate myself in this work with a few highlights. I began teaching in the 1990s, and I recently reflected on that experience in an article I wrote for the journal Language Arts in 2021. In that piece, I explore how I taught about environmental issues, pollution, pesticides, rainforest preservation, and I taught about social justice concerns, mainly gender and race issues in books like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And we challenge, prevailing histories of Christopher Columbus's discovery of America. Yet I taught these as distinct topics and areas of inquiry, the environmental issues and concerns, and these more social justice areas of concern. And in many ways, this mirrored what was happening in the United States at the time. The environmental movement from actually the 1960s on was led predominantly by white, well-resourced groups like the Sierra Club, which was focusing on wildlife preservation issues, planting trees and saving whales, for example. They were not addressing the lived experiences and needs of people living in communities most impacted by continued air, water, and land pollution. These are low-income areas and in predominantly Black and Brown communities. But that was then. However, now it's different. And I ended that piece by discussing how I came to understand that all environmental concerns as entwined with aspects of justice, including racial, gender, and spatial or geographical justice. And as a professor and teacher educator since 2004, I've prioritized working with complex, multifaceted problems in my teaching and research. And two essential collaborators in this work have been Alex Panos here, as well as Mark Belden, who's a social studies educator. And much of this work has had climate justice focus. If we looked at the way students evaluated the reliability of websites about climate change, how they've dialogued across different beliefs about climate, explored ways to read climate denial texts and teaching and curricular possibilities, this journey toward eco-justice literacies, and further explorations of this model, which I'll talk about today. And much of this thinking has led to this recent book publication where Mark Belden and I do a deeper dive into climate denial, how to confront it, and move toward more ecologically sustainable and just futures. And it's been gratifying to receive endorsements from authors and leaders and scholars whom we admire. It's been particularly gratifying to have the opportunity to discuss the book with different groups of educators and organizations, along with legendary civic leaders like Ralph Nader, and have it well received. Okay, so let's move to the first of our three questions. Where are we now? We want to answer this question with ultimately with 10 words. But we'll start with consensus in the climate science community for quite a number of years now about human-caused global warming. Here we see Ed Hawkins' efforts to portray global warming since 1850 as a series of color-coded stripes to highlight the shift from cool to warm over time in an easily understandable way for non-scientists. And here's another visual, this one from the New York Times, offering another metaphor to help grasp the reality of our historical moment and to communicate the urgency for action. So to answer this first question in 10 words, we consider three 10-word batches, all communicating the same basic content. And two key points about these 10 words. It's real important to have simple, clear messages when communicating scientific information. And this is the starting point for me in teaching and research about climate change and climate change denial. Frankly, I don't emphasize the climate science a whole lot in the work that I do. I'm primarily concerned with climate change as a socio-scientific topic. So I'm not interested in debating whether climate change is happening or not. It is. Though I am interested in examining why some people don't accept the consensus. But I think it's essential to be clear that there isn't a serious intellectual debate about climate science. So those 10 words, it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, and we can fix it. These are the importance of clear communication about science. So to check in where we are now in February 2023, the physics of climate science remains non-negotiable. As Greta points out here, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 continues to rise. Fortunately, there is a lot of momentum to address the crisis. There's greater political mobilization, much of it led by youth groups to get, for example, climate policy enacted through the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States, and the ousting of global climate enemies like former President Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. The fact remains, however, much more work needs to be done, and at a more rapid pace. And to situate this "where are we now" question in education, for more than a decade, these words from Desmond Tutu have served as a summons to me to address climate change in my own teaching and research. And when applying his quote to the United States context, it still feels like we haven't moved much beyond a tepid response if the goal is for educators to embrace and prioritize climate change as a global social justice issue. This is not to say that we're in the same place today as we were 13 years ago in 2010. Fortunately, there are substantive efforts being made in the United States across different types of organizations and institutions. We have the New Jersey's Department of Education creating climate change standards across all grade levels and subject areas. We have university-led initiatives like the Center for Climate Literacy, and so much scholarship now coming out. There's books like the edited volume from Joseph Henderson and Andrea Drews, titled Climate Change Education in the United States, as well as no shortage of education-related groups and nonprofit organizations engaged in some form of climate education. And one prominent group is the Climate Reality Project. And we can come back to this. We can explore the state of climate change education more in the discussion if you would like. But for now, let's move on to the second question. How did we get here? So I'll start with a few screenshots about the Nile River. And you might know where I'm heading with this. And that is, the Nile ain't just a river in Egypt, as the saying goes. Climate change and climate denial have been adversely impacting the health of the Nile River and the Nile Basin. So here's our second question. How did we get here? And the three-word answer to that question is industry-led climate denial. It's essential to stress that large fossil fuel companies are primarily responsible for global temperature rise. They were, of course, aided and abetted by other industries, including public relations companies, law firms, and financial institutions. And given this, I think calling climate change human-caused or anthropogenic is misleading. It is industry-caused or industry-led. Now, while this doesn't absolve individuals, especially those of us from the global north, of our responsibilities, it does focus the critique on the industry and influential leaders of this industry. Large fossil fuel companies for decades have engaged in a campaign of deceit and deception and disinformation to manufacture doubt and confusion about climate science and to derail effective climate policy action. There's a network of these fossil fuel industry-led organizations, foundations, and associations have functioned as this climate denial machine to influence politicians and to shape public policy. And this has been very, very well documented. And again, large fossil fuel companies did not act alone, disseminating climate denial disinformation. Other industries are complicit. In our book, we name public relations companies, media corporations, insurance companies, law firms, banks, and financial institutions, as well as the agricultural industry, in particular meat and dairy corporations and trade associations who have long worked in concert with fossil fuel corporations in an anti-regulation agenda. And the recent book from Paul Hawken and his team from Project Drawdown also advocate the need for an industry lens in doing climate work. Talk about the politics industry, clothing, plastics, poverty, banking, war, in really compelling ways. And how we got here can also be understood in terms of intersecting contexts of climate denial, particular economic commitments to extractive capitalism make dealing with climate denial more challenging. It's also no secret how fossil fuel corporations have essentially held many politicians captive to advance their companies' interests. Climate change impacts also are shaped by dominant cultural narratives and myths about American exceptionalism, individualism, the inherent value of competition. All of these are part of our cultural historical legacy. Humans are also, we're prone to denial in various forms, given our many cognitive biases, the ways we search for information that confirms our views. We develop tribal identities in ways that make it difficult to accept disconfirming evidence or perspectives that challenge our own. There's a media context we live in that reinforces these tendencies, as we're more likely to think and live in echo chambers. And finally, climate impacts around the world differ, as does the likelihood of a country embracing climate denial. Climate denial thrives in countries like the United States. So at this point, we've addressed the first two of these questions. Now we consider, where do we go from here? And we have a 4-word response to that question. We need to confront denial and advance eco-justice. And I want to make a case that we can do this again by becoming detectives of climate denial and by becoming delegates for climate justice. So let's explore what this might look like. As climate denial detectives, we can strive to discern the truth about what happens, the causes of things. We weigh different forms of evidence. We use reasoning to make decisions and draw conclusions. Evidence-based reasoning is the lifeblood of inquiry-based teaching and learning in any academic discipline, and it's essential to civic life and democracy. So, and with this, with our climate denial inquiry model, as climate denial detectives, we can identify and investigate climate denial texts. Excuse me about that, I keep jumping around here. And stories. Okay, sorry about that. We can identify and investigate climate denial texts and stories, myths or narratives that we live by. And we think it's important to identify 2 different types of climate denial texts. There's climate science denial, which is the rejection of the scientific evidence. And there's climate action denial, where there is acceptance of the science, but a refusal or an unwillingness to take the necessary actions to address the climate crisis. Climate communication researcher John Cook, he makes this distinction in a slightly different way. He calls it science denial and solutions denial. And as detectives, we also investigate stories we live by. These are dominant narratives or myths that we tacitly accept, often when we're not fully aware that they're operating as stories. Of particular interest are stories that promote climate denial, like humans are the center of existence, separate from nature, that nature is primarily a resource to be used by humans. There's also zero-sum stories related to individualism, ideas that if someone else benefits, then I'm losing. This is a core argument of Heather McGhee's recent book, The Sum of Us, which is a careful examination of this ideology and story. Because all of these stories promote or condone ecological harm, they're considered destructive stories we live by. Now, there are also stories that are more ambivalent. They might have aspects that are beneficial but also harbor destructive elements as well. I think a lot of the emerging kind of green consumerism can fit into this ambivalent category. You might buy more sustainably sourced clothing and goods, for example, and at face value, that's beneficial. But if you buy a lot of it, that's not necessarily beneficial, right? So that would make it more of an ambivalent story, some of the consumerism. And because stories shape how we understand and act in the world, we place them at the center of this model alongside the denial texts. And as the model suggests, we want to be able to move toward what we're calling eco-justice stories to live by. So as climate denial detectives, we work with denial texts and stories, and we understand the need that we need to reckon with the context of denial. Again, these are economic, political, cultural, historical, socio-psychological, media, and geographical contexts. But we also need to consider and investigate our own ecological philosophies, each of our own views about the environment and our relationship to it. These shape how we read and view information. So we need to factor this reflection into our sense-making process. And of note, we depict denial context and eco-sophies as part of a swirling mix that shapes how we read and evaluate denial texts and stories we live by. And as the model suggests, there are two sets of tools or resources we can use as climate denial detectives. They're critical literacies and eco-civic practices. I'm going to focus primarily on critical literacies in these next few slides. The eco-civic practices are ways of engaging with each other. They're focused on dialogue and deliberation and reflexivity and considering counter narratives in our collective sense-making process. So let's work through a couple of examples. And here will be our first example of a denial text. It is a Facebook video.
What the left gets wrong about climate change are, first of all, very numerous examples, but the first and most important one is this idea that all scientists agree that there's a 97% climate consensus, that no one disagrees in the scientific community. And this is perhaps the most outrageous falsehood of all. If you go back 25 years, Al Gore was promoting the same claim that all scientists agreed before we even had a climate debate. And what happens is once you start looking at the 97% claims, we find out that they're quite literally pulled from thin air, in the words of one of the top United Nations scientists, Dr. Richard Toll, or we find out that they're not even 97 scientists. One of the surveys was only 77 scientists, and they were anonymous scientists. And this is how they create a myth. It's a talking point designed so you don't have to think. All scientists agree. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this toothpaste. Why wouldn't I buy that toothpaste? Why wouldn't I believe in climate change? The other myth is that we're in the unprecedented hottest year, hottest decade. The earth is at a boiling point. These hottest year claims are merely political statements, that they're within the margin of error between hottest year statements. And then the most outrageous myth of all is that carbon dioxide is somehow the control knob of the climate. I point out in the book with Ivy League geologists, Nobel Prize winning scientists, that we've had ice ages with higher CO2 levels. The CO2 is not in any way, shape, or form controlling the climate, that there were quite literally hundreds of factors, from ocean cycles, the tilt of the Earth's axis, to clouds, water vapor, volcanoes, and solar cycles, that they do not control. CO2 alone does not control the climate. It is one of these factors that get essentially drowned out, and you can't distinguish its effect from natural variability. What the left and
we're not going to watch it again. So there's a lot going on in this video, this 2-minute video that's had over 10 million views. And with a video like this, we can always ask critical literacy questions. And here are some examples of questions that Mark Belden and I have used, and Alex as well, over time. And so a key first step is to identify what type of climate denial is going on in a particular text. And with this video, this Facebook video, it's a really clear example of climate science denial, rejection of the science. And once we identify a text, a source that is promoting denial, science denial, there's a list of questions or tools we can use. And we have found these particular kinds of questions more useful than the general kind of critical literacy questions, because these directly name the techniques used to promote science denial. And here is that particular framework. And it's based on the work of John Cook and others. And John Cook has a wonderful book here, cartoons, and a mobile application too of the same name that's really wonderful. But what this framework does is helps us identify if it's a climate science, if there's science denial, not just climate science, but in this case it's climate science, but there's science denial going on. Most likely they're using fake experts, there are logical fallacies, they're relying on impossible expectations of scientists, they're using cherry picking or conspiracy theories. One or more of these are at play. And we can, when we apply this framework to the Facebook video, we can see that happening. You know, for example, Richard Toll is not one of the world's top United Nations scientists that's claimed in the video. He's actually an economist, not a scientist. There's logical fallacies and oversimplifications. Climate scientists do not argue that CO2 alone controls the climate. There's cherry picking about the studies related to the 97 scientists, ignoring the more comprehensive and extensive findings about the climate science consensus, for example. Okay, so let's move on to another example here. Again, a key step is to identify what type of climate denial is at work here. And this is a YouTube video produced by the Shell Oil Corporation. Okay, another just 1 minute clip with just so much going on. And again, you know, with any text, we have these critical literacy questions that are great that we can apply and kind of think through as we engage with a video like this. But again, what we found is that, again, if we first identify what type of climate denial is happening in the text, then we might have some other tools and resources at our disposal. And here, this is a really clear example of climate action denial. There's no rejection of climate science here, but it raises questions about whether the necessary actions are being taken to address the climate crisis. So if it is a climate action denial, if we can detect that, then there's these what we call critical literacy plus questions that more directly respond to the type of techniques or tactics that are being used in that source. So these include discourses of delay and denial frames based on the work of Lamb and colleagues, as well as Jeffrey Supran and Naomi Oreskes. And here's a visual of findings from Lamb and colleagues of their taxonomy of these discourses of delay. So when we look at this source with this frame, you know, discourses of delay and frame analysis, we can see that some of these frames and discourses at play again. You know, positioning the fossil fuel industry as essential to enacting solutions to climate change. We see this individualizing responsibility, you know, Shell's attempts to, quote, harness nature and protect forests in the service of, quote, making it easier for customers to tackle their own emissions. There's obvious a whole lot of greenwashing going on here in terms of clean energy and all the visuals used, you know, with trees being vital in the fight against climate change. This video also employs this technique that John Cook calls paltering, which is when companies make claims that are true but misleading, right? This idea that fossil fuel companies, they might truthfully assert that they're advancing low carbon climate solutions. and they have commitments to renewable energies, but they continue their fossil fuel production in disproportionate ways. Okay, so we kind of work quickly through those two denial texts, and we can situate denial texts again within denial context and stories we live by. So just a quick review of what that might look like here. With Facebook, the organization CFACT is free market, anti-regulatory approaches that they promote to environmental issues. They receive funding from conservative foundations. The Facebook platform itself has spread a staggering amount of climate misinformation. The Facebook video targets motivated reasoning and tribal affiliations. So that's all part of the context that are embedded in that, or ways of understanding at least the Facebook video. And with the Shell oil video, we have the economic context of fossil fuel capitalism. It's linked to these cultural narratives about growth and prosperity. And we can see underneath there's still this influence of the lobbying efforts to sway politicians toward industry-friendly policies, all within a social media platform that appeals to our viewers' positive emotions. Okay, so where can I locate denial texts? The short answer is just about everywhere. Greenwashing in particular from corporations is coursing through our culture right now as companies bend over backwards to portray ecological responsible images while in many regards still doing ecological harm. Just about any contemporary promotion by the fossil fuel industry is chock full of climate denial, in particular climate action denial. But there are also possibilities to conduct like historical whodunit investigations to uncover all the ways large fossil fuel companies, again, for decades have been engaged in this campaign of deceit, deception, and disinformation. So supporting this work, the Center for Climate Integrity has a treasure trove of primary documents across 5 decades that captures and catalogs climate denial and what it calls its library. The wonderful investigative journalists over at DSMOG also have a database to mine. The Toxic Docs document website also offers resources. Amy Westervelt's work on Drilled, they're compiling a database as well with these artifacts, basically, that we'll be able to access and apply. We can apply these tools of Critical Literacies Plus as we engage with these denial texts. Also want to note that there has been a recognition that outright climate science denial is much less prevalent than climate action denial. For example, leading fossil fuel companies, they're not rejecting the climate science consensus. However, I think it's important to note that these cultural forces of climate science denial still persist. It's primarily through social media and organizations like the Heartland Institute, a key cog in the climate denial machine, and the long-running websites like Junk Science. And there are just so many examples of climate denial out there for us to identify and work with. And there's no shortage of attempts to deny, deceive, and delay necessary action on global climate change. I think some of this work from this recent publication highlights, the attempts to call climate activists hypocrites if they get on an airplane, if they're not not adhering to particular purity standards when it comes to their ways they are in the world. There's this absolutionism, which is really fascinating. The ways they suggest that one country, we can, for example, the United States would absolve ourselves from taking climate action because other countries aren't taking the same action. And that's kind of captured in this little image here about the Paris Climate Treaty. And it's not surprising that renewable energy and electric vehicles are the target of these efforts as well. And it's important to note that these tactics are increasingly linked to like a free market ideologies, as well as identity and cultural politics, linked to electoral integrity and public health, vaccines in particular. Any extension of government power, including climate action, is perceived as a threat to individual liberties. So climate change and climate denial is wrapped up increasingly wrapped up in these politics. Okay. To further dive into our responses, where do we go from here? We can pose and pursue questions that align with core academic disciplines or subject areas. And some questions cut across disciplines and don't fit neatly into any one category. By no means this is not an exhaustive list. It's just the goal is to provide a way into climate denial. So I'll just quickly move through some of these. There are many questions tied to economics that we can explore with students of varying ages about responsibilities for climate denial and systems of capitalism and neoliberalism and ideas about growth and prosperity. These are all really worthwhile to inquire into and explore. Same thing for politics and civics. Alex and I and Mark have found this one highlighted question particularly generative. What best explains the range of climate change beliefs in the United States, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence and consensus about the existence and causes of human-caused climate change. There are inquiry pathways tied to history, think about the historical context of climate change, colonialism, and slavery, as well as these historical cultural narratives and assumptions. There's ways of thinking about religion and faith traditions. There's no shortage of kind of historical possibilities. The sociology and psychology also offer pathways about understanding climate denial and climate emotions and inaction, and also think about what language might be most useful to help us navigate the psychological and emotional landscape of climate change and its impacts. Questions about the media, and more recently, I found questions about, should media companies accept fossil fuel advertising dollars, or what ways should social media be regulated, being really generative with students. And again, questions about geography, thinking about the global north-south divides and ways, and encouraging people to explore ways that climate change and denial is part of our own lives, in our families, and our communities. Additional inquiry possibilities include the fossil fuel industry's role in academia, big tech's impact on climate change. The legal front is also an active area for a range of investigations. There's an ever-increasing number of towns, cities, counties, and states filing lawsuits against fossil fuel companies, seeking redress for climate harms from their products have caused. And fossil fuel industry does not want to be held responsible for the effects of climate change. One fascinating strategy is how, big oil companies, they want to convince us that climate change was mentioned in pop culture and major media outlets, in the 90s. Therefore, they don't have responsibility for the current climate crisis. It's really fascinating to suggest that, for us to forget that they had anything to do with the industries, with their disinformation campaign to mislead the public. So the arts, there's lots of different opportunities in the arts for different pathways. These climojis are fascinating. I want to include a couple of those in there. Okay, so I want to address the second part of the answer to this question real quickly. Where do we go from here in terms of advancing eco-justice? This involves being a delegate for climate justice. Delegates serve in the interests of others. They often participate in wider conversations in different kinds of official settings. They're representatives to advance the interests of their particular group. We can start by defining justice as the quality of being fair, reasonable, and equitable. So as a climate justice delegate, we need to become really informed about the ways climate change can magnify and compound existing injustices. We need to understand also how climate-related challenges intersect, again, with various forms of gender, racial, socioeconomic, and spatial or geographic injustices within the United States and around the world. As delegates of climate justice, we need to become more informed about the range of justice-focused proposals and projects underway out there in the world to prevent or mitigate severe climate impacts. And all those folks working toward different visions and versions of the future. It includes shining a light on the inspiring climate justice efforts around the world, especially the work of youth to create more equitable and just futures. So equipped with these deeper understandings about climate solutions and the work of these folks, As delegates of climate justice, we need to participate in wider conversations and policy discussions in our own schools and communities, as well as across county, state, regional, national, or international settings, as representatives there to advance the interests of climate justice. It can include in advocating at local school board meetings for the teaching and learning of climate change and climate justice across subject areas and grade levels, participating in town council meetings to propose and deliberate local actions, attending educational conferences, helping hold professional organizations and its members accountable for timely, decisive action, and even participating in large-scale environmental events like United Nations summits. And perhaps most importantly, the work of being a climate justice delegate helps mark a shift from climate destructive stories to more beneficial stories, or what we call eco-justice stories to live by. So at this point, we've addressed these three questions. And we have these two identities to consider taking on: detectives of climate denial and delegates of climate justice. And we won't be alone doing this. There's so many inspiring people doing this work, all these wonderful authors, scholars and journalists and podcasters and educators, creating curriculum and other resources. And I'll end with the website that I've been working on to kind of help consolidate some of these resources. It's called denialtojustice.com. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you today. It's been an honor.
Thanks, James. So what I thought I would do, sort of as a response a bit to what James shared, is talk about how I've been thinking about climate denial in Florida and acknowledge some of the complexities of doing climate denial in different contexts. And so climate denial work in different contexts. So I just wanted to take a minute before we open for discussion to just acknowledge that situating the climate denial model and doing climate denial inquiry looks different depending on where we are on this living earth. And just to take a moment quickly to recognize that the work that I've been doing with teachers takes place on the stolen lands that were once home to the Tocobaga, Seminole, and Calusa people, as well as their ancestors going back over 10,000 years. And we found that that's really important because institutions of higher learning and educational disciplines such as literacy have reinforced settler colonialism and instances of climate denial. And so we think that that's important to acknowledge in our work. So just starting here with an image of Ian, which might be very familiar to folks. The storm came last October, and for us in Florida, the storm around climate denial, around denial of basic rights in our educational spaces continues and grows, actually. And so this storm feels like it's still very much with us as we clean up from it, but also in less and more nebulous ways. So I'm going to start here with a statement by one of my teacher colleagues who I work closely with, Dr. Precious Simonette, who's a Florida State Teacher of the Year, and she's from Coral Gables in Miami. And we were talking about where we are working right now and what it feels like to work here. And she said, in response to recent legislation, and so my head was like, I think I might risk losing my job because how could I not teach my students stories, right? And so I think when we're thinking about climate denial, and we're thinking about denial context and the kinds of texts we bring in the stories we live by and that we want to live by, it's impossible to forget that many of the stories that make up our future are the children we work with stories and the teachers who help facilitate those stories to be part of educational spaces. And so as I sat with the CDIM, the Climate Denial Inquiry Model, and thought about how I might share a little bit today, I'm going to focus just on 3 areas because that's where we are right now in our work together. We are thinking about the denial context we're operating in, we're thinking about the stories we currently live by and confronting those and trying to develop ecosophies that help us be resilient and navigate teaching and learning in difficult times. So questions that we're thinking about right now and that I'm thinking about with my colleagues are, how do we contend with educational contexts of denial and injustice as they intersect with our teaching and literacies learning? What catharsis can we find in naming the stories we currently live by in order to move forward within unique contexts of denial? And how do our ecosophies intersect with where we are on this living earth? And so the first thing I just need to say is that it takes a lot of work to acknowledge and confront specific denial contexts. And for us in Florida right now, this is taking the form of things like the Parental Rights in Education Act, better known as the Don't Say Gay bill, the Stop Woke Act, and how the stories are literally being ripped from teachers' hands. And so, you know, when I think about the work of the Center for Climate Literacy and how much it centers on bringing stories to school spaces, teachers are very afraid because they can face felony charges for the kinds of stories they bring into their classrooms. So this is a context of denial that exacerbates the kinds of contexts of denial I think James was really digging into, related specifically to the fossil fuel industry and the myths that get perpetuated and the safety of peoples to do this kind of work. And we know that across the world, climate activists are murdered at an exceptionally high rate, and safety and survivability is essential to think about. And so for teachers losing their jobs is something they navigate in confronting denial. And then we're also thinking about placing the stories we live by. This is a piece that was just published in the wonderful journal that the Center for Climate Literacy has put out by one of my teacher collaborator colleagues, Kate Worthwine. And in it, she is actually sharing an image from her own classroom superimposed on the environmental context we live in here in Florida, which is rapidly facing development, climate gentrification, sea level rise, the kinds of eco-justice issues which are exacerbated by denial, right? And when the stories we get to tell are ripped from us, it's harder to confront them. And the teachers really wonder things like what Kate is saying: how do I teach stories? How do I teach survival now that they've taken my books, and I would also say my media, away? And Kate very, very clearly believes that we can't be dislocated from our bodies, and our bodies cannot be dislocated from where we are. And then finally, things that we've been thinking about and trying to work towards are establishing joyful and cathartic ecosophies. And that is at least a first step to actually doing the kinds of inquiry activities that James was talking about with K-12 students. So here, Olwen Watson, a teacher in the Tampa Bay area, recognized that she has to find her purpose. She's needing to fight. And she said, when we talked about this, she said, I must fight for her, but I mean my students, I mean the earth, it's all the same thing. Recognizing that these are all the same pieces of the puzzle, right? And so when I think about how to move forward and what the kinds of demands of a climate denial inquiry model are, where I am, which is how I like to look at things, is that we need stories we live by to be part of demanding cathartic confrontation of those denial contexts, that denial context can't be separated from educational issues of injustices like we're navigating here right now. And these established and emerging individualized and shared ecosophies are part of climate denial inquiry. Like there's a personal inquiry, a personal critical inquiry that must happen for each of us where we are on the living earth in order to dig in to any kind of text in a classroom setting. And so with that, I just wanted to give a brief pop of storytelling about how teachers can do this before they begin doing it with their students, and that I think that's really important. So James, we have some questions in the chat, but we're fully open to more questions, but I wanted to throw them out there so that we don't waste any time. There's a really good one. Okay, So one question was, how do you engage apathy when it comes to denial? Like, how do we engage with issues of apathy and denial in the classroom or beyond?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. What I find interesting, and one of the things we've done, Alex and I have done, is when we work with students, primarily pre-service teachers in the university, we start with the Yale Climate Change Communication Program. They have a survey called the Six America Survey, and it helps locate people on the spectrum of like how strong their climate beliefs are, from alarmed to dismissive on the other end. So there are a number of students who in the past have been in that middle ground, who apathy isn't the category, but they're either disengaged or they're not necessarily alarmed or concerned. So what's interesting about the work around climate denial is that most people don't like to be duped. They like to figure out these techniques. And students from university, even younger, they tend to be kind of natural truth seekers. They have their kind of truth antenna up. They like to be able to detect, when they're being misled or when they're being deceived. So I think that's one way in to say, like, did you know that these companies have been using these tactics for a really long time? And those tactics mirror tactics that have been used by the tobacco industry and other denial industries over time. So there's an inquiry there that can be interesting to folks, even if they're not necessarily invested in climate change work per se.
Yeah, I think that that's a wonderful way to look at it. And I would also say there's less apathy that I'm experiencing, and it feels like there's less apathy there, and there's more concern. Yeah, thanks. So there's another question here. How would we think about or recommend addressing climate depression with youth?
Yeah, it's another great question that, and in the book, we don't really go into that facet of climate work, the need for that. And there are organizations out there and websites and resources. It's increasingly a concern, and a lot of people are thoughtfully addressing the range of climate emotions. Part of it is naming those emotions, which is really important. The climate grief and depression and sadness and anger, frankly, too. Like there's a bundle of emotions to work through. And increasingly we see universities responding, and other school districts are starting to be more responsive to these needs, which are all really encouraging signs.
Yeah, I would just add to that, something I've thought a lot about is where how to support, in particular, frontline communities and communities that are actively being impacted in the present by climate change or eco-justice, and using the kinds of tools that we've come to understand are really helpful, such as culturally responsive approaches and trauma-informed approaches, as they intersect with these complex issues. There hasn't been much work done in Florida following Ian, but I am in touch with one educator down in Lee County, which was where the hurricane hit. And she's been talking about trying to incorporate more trauma-informed pedagogies in her classroom. But again, thinking about context of denial, social emotional learning is one of the areas that is being restricted by state legislation at present. And so there's a lot of complexity to being able to do that work with youth in schools. And so finding outside resources, I think, is another important avenue. I also work occasionally with a food justice organization, the St. Pete Youth Farm, and they're working on joyful, powerful ways to take control over an issue of eco-justice like food.
Yeah, I'm glad you emphasized that, Alex. The work around how to sustain climate activism or engagement in climate issues, the importance of joy and celebration and solidarity and collaboration, that we're part of something larger than ourselves. There are those emotions that are really catalytic, as for change and action as well.
Yeah. And I think, let's see if we have any other questions. We've only got a couple more minutes, unless one comes up. Let's see. Okay, so what are ways that educators might collaborate with other educators in schools or districts so that their work can be both unified and inter or transdisciplinary?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I mean, I think there's so many possible forms of collaboration, whether it is through online connecting and meetups and discussion groups and book club discussion groups, topics, to sharing and creating and sharing resources, curricular and instructional resources, study groups that could be formed around that, teacher study groups. I know, Alex, you've been doing this work for a while too. The importance of the broader importance of just having people talking with each other, and being a sense of community and the sense of solidarity that comes from that. So whether connecting through professional organizations, local organizations, Facebook groups, other social media kinds of connections, there's no shortage of those kinds of possibilities. I think in my own experience in doing that kind of work, I've always found it most generative and useful when it is grounded in either creating curriculum and trying it out, or creating lesson plans and trying them out and talking about what worked and what didn't work. I've personally got more out of those kinds of collaborations than get-togethers where we're just talking about possibilities or doing book club discussion groups. Those are valuable as well, but I've always found, let's get right into it, what we're trying to do and what's working, what's not working, going through that reflective process.
Yeah, I know that's what the teachers I work with are clamoring for, is more space and more time to talk with one another about how to navigate and do things in their classrooms, and get to the nitty gritty of what is working and what isn't working. And that brings such a sense of community. So.
And it's incumbent upon folks who have some leverage, whether you're working at a university or you're a principal or a district leader or administrator in some capacity, that it's incumbent upon us or whoever's in those positions to create the conditions and the spaces for this work to happen. Whether it's creating resources for teachers to have these conversations, opportunities to create curriculum and lesson plans and try them out. And so that's all part of the broader, all hands on deck approach here in terms of, the work that needs to be done.
Yeah, and the bravery to do it. I just got a message today from a teacher collaborator colleague who said she put forward a proposal for a creative writing class on climate change for next fall, and she's very hopeful that it's going to take place, and she's so nervous about it, and we talked about it a lot beforehand, but she made it happen. So it's exciting stuff, and I think
yeah, and just a quick note, Alex, I know you've done some of this work too. Sometimes in a particularly difficult political context, you try to find avenues into the work. And I know that you've done some, you've emphasized the importance of just nature and being in nature. And that's much more nonpartisan at this point politically, to think about just the value of nature and being out there. So there are ways and the importance of preserving ecosystems and so forth, and clean water and clean air. And there's a wide consensus around those kinds of issues. So I think it does require some skillful, political maneuvering. That's part of the journeying too, that I'm looking forward to what you and your colleagues, all those teachers, all the insights you'll be able to share with us about those journeys.
Thanks, James. Always good to talk, and thanks for so many folks for coming today. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for the Center for Climate Literacy. Really appreciate the work you're doing, inspired